I've always loved Cyberpunk 2077. Through all the hate, all the vitriol, and despite everyone online screaming about how bad of a game it was for so long, against a sea of hate, I never stopped pushing back relentlessly on this channel because I truly believed this game was hiding something so unforgettable and meaningful. Something beyond all the controversy, an experience with unmatched characters and moments that pierced my very soul. And that's why the hate for this game was so sad to see, a hate that blinded most players to the important messages hidden beneath it all. And that's because, in my opinion, Cyberpunk 2077 and now Phantom Liberty on top of it is the most meaningful game ever made, and my personal favorite of all time. That doesn't mean it's the most fun, the most replayable, or even the best RPG, and it certainly had and has its fair share of issues that we'll discuss here too. But you see, this game, this one game more than any other in my life, spoke to me in a way that so few things ever have, becoming more than just a fun RPG I picked up and forgot like all the others, but rather making me contemplate on the most important lessons in all of our lives, about family, friends, fame, fortune, love, and what it all means anyways. Because despite all the endless controversy and hate this game garnered for years, there's an adventure here that finally, after countless updates and work from a team of relentlessly passionate developers, has become the game it was always meant to be. The greatest comeback in gaming history that has inspired so many, in the end, to fall utterly in love. Cyberpunk isn't the game a lot of people thought it would be. It's not GTA in the future, it's not the most in-depth sandbox ever made, and it's certainly not the next generation of RPGs. Baldur's Gate 3 took that title. But what Cyberpunk is one of the most deep, meaningful, and everlasting experiences I've ever had in a game. Before we can dive into that though, we need to take a look back on why this special game had so much controversy, and the story of a product that for so long was rejected, when all along it was home to something so powerful. You see, back in 2020 when Cyberpunk first released, it was met with some of the most hate I've ever seen for a video game. I distinctly remember waking up every weekend to play what I thought was such a fun and engaging game, but every time I looked online, it seemed like I was the only one who thought so. Thousands of people in every form across the internet gathered around to tear this game to shreds, and because of it, my faith in it too began to wane. I started to notice more of the bugs, the lack of deep RPG features, and cars that would spawn in the sky only to drop down and explode into a crowd where the police system was basically non-existent. But then, every time I started to lose hope, I would go on another quest, meet another character, and most importantly, experience another moment that proved to me that this game was so much more than the sum of its parts. And while nowadays this game has finally been fixed in the eyes of many people, I don't see it that way. I see it as a game that has always had so many issues, but even then, the core of what makes art beautiful, meaningful, and memorable has always been intrinsic to its mantra. If you go back and actually watch that 40-minute demo of the game from years ago, or read all the press releases and updates from the time, something you'll notice is that a lot of the hype and expectations were becoming unrealistic not because of CD Projekt Red themselves, but the community too. One of my favorite examples of this is Reddit posts talking about features in the game that never existed. Hundreds of upvotes on posts about mechanics that weren't even in the game, yet everyone gathered around and talked about them as if they were, even when they had never been spoken about. Don't believe me? Well, here's a perfect example. There was an interview in a GameStar article months before the game's release with some of the developers, and in the audio section, someone on Reddit who apparently spoke German translated a lot of the discussion into text format on Reddit. This included claims that there were thousands of unique NPCs with daily routines, a police system that would put GTA to shame, and flying cars. So the community latched onto this post, and after thousands of upvotes, everyone was excited about what they were hearing. But here's the thing, that translation was all wrong. The developers never said there were unique routines for all the wholly unique NPCs. They never claimed the police were the greatest of all time with max tac always touching down, or that cars had garages and could fly in this article, for example. Nonetheless though, soon these claims were being picked up by bigger publications. You can go back and look up these articles, even referencing the Reddit post or the GameStar article itself, all making completely false and made up claims about a game that wasn't even out yet. And here's the best part. Developers themselves from CD Projekt Red came into these forums and commented, letting people know that the claims were not true, but they were downvoted, screamed at, and ignored. And for months after this, even beyond this one example, so many lies and unrealistic expectations were spread everywhere. But that doesn't mean the creators of Cyberpunk had no fault here. They did make claims that were overzealous. They did lie, and most of all, committed scummy acts like hiding last-gen console performance until release and basically scamming their customers. They should have been more diligent in letting people know in official press releases about all the lies, but instead they leaned into it. And most of all, they showed poor character and leadership when they needed it most. We shouldn't look back and forgive all that happened, but we should remember that the story isn't as black and white as you've been told. I played this game on everything day one, and I loved it even then, and there are lots of people like me too. So don't just believe it was horrible because you never played and everything you heard told you so. And there's so many things too people complain about nowadays that don't actually matter. That cutscene with Jackie was never meant to be a fully playable first act, and I think the game is better that way. It wouldn't fit the story it was trying to tell. It would just add a bunch of needless padding. The complete lack of choice and consequence was overblown, as there's many points in the game like saving Takamura where it's never explained that you can do something, but if you give it a shot, it can drastically change the story. The life paths being so short, in my opinion, is fine. It gives the teams more time to focus on what most players will actually see anyways, and each of them set the scene in their own way regardless of it being short, and they have a lot of interesting dialogue options throughout the game. Or what about that hacking minigame or wall climbing that we saw in the original 40-minute demo? To this day, so many people complain that we never got that game and instead got something worse. But did you know that wall running was taken out so they could focus more on making the environments more interesting, with buildings with lots of structures sticking out that would make wall running impossible? If you look at the demo from years ago that got people so hyped, many of the buildings in the background of the game have so much more life and design nowadays than when they were first presented. Just look at this scene, for example. And if you go back and watch the hacking minigame again, it looks cool the first time, but imagine having to do this every time you try to engage in combat with hacking. That would get old and boring super fast. And what we got instead is very intuitive, fast-paced, and most importantly, a fun implementation that works so much better as an actual game, not just a cool tech demo. I'd argue that even what we got at launch was much better than the demo we originally were presented, and nowadays, after more updates, it's undeniably so. And that's because instead, we got characters and stories that would live with us forever, and lessons that prove the game was never about being Grand Theft Auto in the future, but rather a narrative that would propel itself into our hearts. But for most people, they have only recently realized this, and that's because after 3 years of patches, the game is finally in the state most always wanted it to be. Ever since the release of patch 1.6 and Edge Runners, and now especially with Phantom Liberty and the 2.1 update, the game finally has dusted off its shoulders and been allowed to shine like it always deserved. Nowadays, when I go online and look at the Cyberpunk forums and Reddit posts, it's amazing just how positive and celebrated this game is now. How much love there is for the story, its characters, and even outside property like the Edge Runners anime. Before, spin-off places like Low Sodium Cyberpunk had to be made for the select few people that enjoyed the game to even talk about it without endless hate. But nowadays, internet forums like this seem completely pointless, as the love for the game is so grand, it's almost hard to find hate from non-trolls anymore. So even though it took many years and a diligence to ignore the backlash knowing they had something great on their hands, CDPR have finally slowly crawled their way back into the good graces of most gamers. Now there are activities like real police chases and even max tac, a fully rehauled skill tree that makes the combat much more streamlined, and countless quality of life features that just make the moment-to-moment gameplay gameplay much more enjoyable than before, and in my opinion, it's the most beautiful comeback in the history of games. Because here's the cold hard truth. The things that make and made Cyberpunk 2077 so great have always been there. This isn't a comeback story about making something bad good, it's about revealing to the world that there was always something there. One of the most beautiful stories of all time that deserves to be heard, but was being shrouded by the endless hate online. Even today, after Phantom Liberty and patch 2.0, the things I see most people celebrating about the game online are the exact same things that were always so impactful about this experience, there since day one. Watching Judy cry for the last friend she had, covered in blood in a bathtub, screaming in pain because she feels like it's all her fault as you stand there hopeless and in shock. Hearing the weakness in Johnny's voice at the oil fields as he finally opens up to you about realizing he never became the legend he always dreamed of, but instead a mean and egotistical maniac that drove all those that cared about him away because the only thing he cared about was his own problems. Or looking into Pan Am's eyes as she gives you a smile and a toast to the friend that you lost, trying to pull off the biggest heist of a lifetime, showing you that someone in this godforsaken city actually cares about you, and there is an entire family waiting to take you in. It was never about the police chases, NPCs with unique day-night cycles, a living, breathing world, or a sandbox that was devoid of all bugs and glitches. This game was always so much more than that. It has a deeper meaning, the likes of which I have never seen pulled off this well in any other entertainment product, even outside of games, at least for me. And the reason this redemption means so much more is because it finally allowed so many others to see it too. For years it felt like no one was actually playing the same game I was. They were just listening to the hate they heard online or only searching for the bad while playing because of preconceived notions. I almost felt gaslighted, as if people refused to accept that maybe this game was hiding something really great too. But now it has proven its home to something greater. And most of all, it's because Cyberpunk focuses on providing what I think is the biggest lessons we can all learn in life, in maybe the most impressive and awe-inspiring fantasy and sci-fi setting to date. You know, Cyberpunk is the first open world game where I never fast travel. The city, the lights, the sounds, the music blaring on the radio as you drive hundreds of miles an hour through busy streets, that's what this game's all about. There's an enormous amount of scale and wonder in every location. Mega buildings stretch well into the sky, neon lights make every scene at night burst with color, and the sounds of the city as you move from small back streets into open and sprawling highways sells the experience perfectly. Without a doubt, Cyberpunk has the best city put to games ever, and it's not even close. It feels less like a video game level and more like a real place. There's a history to every location, obvious remnants to the past, along with a key focus on making everything in the world feel realistic and lived in. When an NPC in game calls you Chun or refers to their lovers as inputs, it all just feels right. It feels natural to the world on offer here and makes every scene and moment that much more convincing. When you first step into Konpeki Plaza, for instance, to steal the data shard, looking at the staff in the hotel covered from head to toe in gold plating shows you everything you need to know. People in this world are nothing more than an asset to big corporations. Humanity and individuality is at its lowest point, and money, power, and influence is what truly matters. And that isn't obvious because it's talked about in dialogue lines across the game. It's obvious because the world itself acts as if that's truly the case, and every interaction you have within it sells every bit of lore just as well. I've heard so many people talk about how the open world doesn't feel alive or worth it either, but for the most part, I disagree here. Even though NPCs don't have realistic routines throughout the day or amazing AI and interactions like, say, Red Dead Redemption 2, I still think just having these huge crowds of people walking around everywhere really adds to the immersion of the game. Yes, they're more set dressing for the world than actual people, but I think that's fine. Sure, having them all act realistically would be great, but the hate for this open world was overblown too. If you actually take the time to run around all the back alleys and secret areas, you'll find so many quests, fights, and loot that's all rewarding. Is it the most alive feeling open world ever? No, definitely not, but it does succeed at its main goal of immersing you in this world so deeply. deeply. Next time you play, put on some headphones and just walk slowly around any of the downtown areas. Listen to the hustle and bustle and sounds of gunshots in the distance, or birds chirping by the city square. This open world could certainly be improved in a lot of ways, but it does what it needs to do most. And because the camera is in a forced first-person perspective, everywhere you go, you can't help but be swept up into this world and its history. You're forced to look people in the eyes and see their pain as they tell you stories from their past, or watch as violence and beauty alike erupt right in front of your character's own eyes. The real biggest accomplishment of this game, in my opinion, is just how believable the characters and the world are. These aren't romances like in Baldur's Gate where everyone wants to have sex with you the second they see you. These aren't superheroes we see in Marvel movies who feel like they're spitting out one-liner after another. These characters feel like real people, and the world they live in feels like its own character all to itself, one that would carry on with or without you. Characters have their own personalities, their own motives, and most of all, journeys that define the people they were and the person they become, all based on small decisions you can make with how you interact with each of them. And because of how masterfully all of these immersive elements are intertwined, you wind up getting a game that is so good not because it has the best graphics ever, or the coolest world, or an A-list celebrity cast acting as some of the characters, but so good because it has such a deeper meaning to it all than most games, whose biggest aim is just being fun and entertaining. And a special mention has to be given to the music in this game too. There are countless times in main and side missions alike where a song would start to pick up in the background and truly pull me into a scene and evoke such strong emotions, whether that be feeling sad or badass alike. There's a reason each and every side and main mission in this game are named after songs, and that's because music is an absolutely integral part of the product on offer here. And Cyberpunk wouldn't even be half the game it was if it wasn't for the masterful use of music and sound in almost every scene to elevate it to new levels entirely. You know, when I first stepped into that broken down house in the middle of the desert during a raging storm with Pan Am, something finally clicked for me on my first playthrough. I realized that there just simply isn't any other game out there quite like this one, that has the moments that hit this hard. Don't get me wrong, I love things like Red Dead Redemption or Mass Effect and the stories and characters on display there. But looking into Pan Am's eyes as her face curled into a smile, and putting your hands around her as you reminisce on just what she means to you, all while the music started to slowly swell into the scene and capture it entirely, it's a feeling no other game has quite been able to hit. And Cyberpunk is absolutely full of moments like this, like laying on a boat and listening to Carrie Eurodyne play a new song as the wind and waves crash against the bow, like looking over a lake that used to be Judy's home as a sunset blazes in the distance and the sounds of cars honking fades into obscurity, listening to a man kidnapped and driven into servitude to the very corporations destroying the world defend them so elegantly, explaining that maybe they aren't as evil as they seem. This world and the people in it are all imperfect in their own ways, just like our real world. And because of that, the stories and narratives that you undergo here tackle some of the most depressing and depraved things in all of our humanity, but each with such care and such masterful writing that puts CDPR into a league of their own. Cyberpunk 2077 isn't GTA in the future. It isn't supposed to be a massive open sandbox where you can do anything you want. And that's because I think it's something that's much better than all that, something much more meaningful. A dive into what it means to be human, to love, to sacrifice, and to lose our very souls or fight until our last breath in the service of what really matters in life. A set of character pieces that look at the most evil, but also the most beautiful parts of what it means to live a life. The things that make us cry at night and the things that awake us in the morning with a fire in our souls to make things right. About giving us a look into a world with no happy endings, but rather lessons that will last with us for a lifetime. And the single most impactful moments in this collage of so many, the ones that solidify this game as real art, are the endings, where we can either choose to forge a path in a blaze of glory and become the living legend we always dreamed of, or instead forgo all of that for something even greater, for family, friends, and a purpose to something more than ourselves. In almost every ending in Cyberpunk, we are met with the sad reality that we are going to die in 6 months. And by choosing to put our name in the pantheon of time, we simply live out our last days rich and famous, but with those by our side moving on. If If we abandon all our friends in order to go find a cure in space, we simply are met with a nightmare of our own creation, being forced to sit and accept the monster we have become. But when we instead stop and think about others, and look at what all the fighting was really about, then we get the actually good endings to this game. Sailing on a tank to Arizona with little hope to live, but surrounded by love and a band of nomads who took you in when no one else would. Or giving up our doomed body in order for Johnny Silverhand to have one last chance at redemption, at finding his own sense of love and belonging too. Only by sacrificing ourselves and our own selfish goals in the service of others do we finally find solace in our death. Life isn't about a blaze of glory, it's about the quiet life, giving back to a world and city even when it has taken so much from you. You know, there's an ending to this game a lot of people never see, and it's the saddest one, where instead of choosing to fight on whatever way you see fit, you can take your own life right at the final hour and put a bullet through your brain as the sounds of Night City drown out the last breaths of your legacy. And then you are forced to sit and watch as every character you knew calls you to leave one last message. Seeing the pain in their eyes, the struggle in their soul, and the utter horror you have put them through, it's about as beautiful a message as any form of art, games, movies, or music alike could ever have. Showing us firsthand that we matter, no matter how hard life gets, no matter how much pain and struggle there is, and no matter how strong that pull to become rich and famous at the expense of others can be, there's a deeper and more provoking meaning to life than all that bullshit. A message that only a game like Cyberpunk can pull off, and one that's more powerful than anything else this game was ever hyped to be. And now, finally with Phantom Liberty, we can see the final confirmation of this. Because in Phantom Liberty, if you choose to give up Songbird in the end to the NUSA and sell her out against her wishes, then you do get the chance to save V's life. After 2 years in a coma, you awake to find that you are cured, you're no longer dying. But as a sacrifice, you no longer have your implants, and more importantly, seemingly no longer have your friends either. You left Songbird, Pan Am, Judy, River, Johnny. You left them all behind in order to save yourself. And what you get in return should be the greatest gift of all, your life. But instead, you learn that by abandoning everyone else around you, you really don't have that much of a life to come back to anyways. Now forced to live the rest of your life as a nobody, right where you started. Life isn't about doing what will make you the biggest legend in all of Night City, or about trying to save ourselves. It's about helping those around us no matter the cost. Because even if it means you will die or lose those hopes and dreams you always grew up with, you will inspire a kind of love and purpose that will lead to the biggest change of all. The type of sacrifice that would cure a place like Night City, but that too many people aren't willing to make. You know, the ending I first got in Phantom Liberty was actually one where I sided with Solomon Reed and worked to capture Songbird in a secret underground Militech facility. And after finally working my way through an absolute horror scene, I found Songbird strapped into the core begging for help. Begging for me to finally end her life so that she could be rid of all of the pain that everyone around her was putting her through. Her mind had been melted by the black wall, and her future was now most certainly nothing but horror and pain endlessly filtered from a mind that was no longer her own. And when she looked me in the eyes and cried and wailed in pain, begging for me to pull the plug, something hit me. It was never about me. The journey, the heist, the quest, everything I had gone through it all was about others. So hearing Reed call and tell us to keep Songbird alive so that he could hand her over to the NUSA, I looked back into Songbird's soulless eyes and saw the agony that she would be put through if I let her leave. So despite it being my only chance at survival, the only way V could have a shot at surviving the entire mess that they got themselves into in the first place, I decided to let Songbird go. Because this story was never about V and whether or not they survived. It was about teaching us that sometimes the hardest sacrifices in life, the ones at our own expense, can create a world for others that is so much more meaningful and powerful. By letting Songbird go to the moon, or what some might call heaven in my ending, and then choosing to live out my final months alive with the Aldecaldos or giving up my body for Johnny, it's only then that the game does what no others have. Show us firsthand what the real meaning to life all is, and why it all matters. And that's a more powerful message than any amount of gameplay or open world and sandbox improvements could ever capture. Cyberpunk 2077 was always special. It just took a couple of years and some fixes for people to finally realize it. The thing is though, I don't blame people for not enjoying the game up until the final patches and DLC, because now after doing multiple new playthroughs with Phantom Liberty and the 2.0 update, I can say without a doubt that Cyberpunk 2077 has never been better. First of all, the updates to the base game and mechanics are all amazing. The new perk trees and UI are much better than before, and each tree now has an actual sense of progression and distinct style that before was harder to see at a glance. And there are more skills with direct and interesting impacts on the game as opposed to passives with boring modifiers. Combat itself is also improved, with new animations for melee finishers and fights, better AI that provides more of a challenge, and a more in-depth netrunning skill tree where combos and countering enemy netrunners becomes much more crucial, especially on higher difficulties. The thing about Cyberpunk's combat though that makes it so amazing is just how badass it makes you feel. Whether you are making entire bands of enemies off themselves or explode into a flurry of fire and electricity as a netrunner, or if you're slicing bodies into 20 pieces as a katana-wielding ninja with slow motion as you deflect bullets with your sword. Every single type of playstyle in Cyberpunk really lives up to the fantasy of being a cybernetic warrior who has enhanced their body to great lengths. It feels like a lot of other single-player games focus way too much on balance and making sure things are fair or challenging. And while Cyberpunk now isn't just a walk in the park, allowing players to craft some of the most overpowered and crazy builds is part of what makes the combat here so satisfying. After all, it's a single-player game. Let us break the systems. Let us create crazy overpowered builds and live out a fantasy. And on this level, I can't think of many other RPGs that do it this well. There's so many different builds and ways to play, and even to this day, I don't think Cyberpunk gets enough compliments on how well it all comes together. Even small things like aiming your gun around cover just feels so much more automatic and fluid than most games that attempt it. There are studios dedicated to first-person shooting combat that have cover systems that don't even feel remotely as good, or shooting that feels more floaty. And it's easy to forget, but this is CD Projekt Red's first attempt at a first-person shooter game, and they pulled it off better here than most anyone else in the business. Shooting feels meaty and tactile. Enemies ragdoll and explode into a bloody mess when using heavy weaponry like shotguns, and with other builds, you can move and dodge at breakneck speeds, along with parkouring across buildings that almost make it feel like you're playing the next Titanfall or Mirror's Edge game. Even just watching someone else who is good at the gameplay makes you want to fire it back up and try a new build. And there's moments and things you can do in this game that make you feel like you were in a cutscene you would see in another game when you're really just playing in real time. Like clips you can watch where someone slows down time, jumps out of a car, shoots someone chasing them in midair, and then lands right back into the car as they drive away. There just aren't moments like this in many other games, and the select few times there are, it's because it was a pre-planned moment or cutscene, or the entire game was built around mechanics like wall running in, say, Titanfall. In Cyberpunk, moments like this happen all the time and are completely different depending on the build you choose. And on top of this, most gigs, side missions, or main missions all give you multiple ways to tackle objectives. You can go in guns blazing from the front door, or sneak your way in undetected, or even try talking your way out of many encounters just using your wit. And instead of just trying to pass dialogue checks or stat checks, you actually have to pick dialogue that would make sense in the situation and see if you can outsmart your opponent. The game takes a lot of cues from some of the great immersive sim giants of old, like Deus Ex, and while it doesn't ever reach those heights in terms of mission design, the fact that it even comes close is a testament to just how amazing this game is, considering that there's an entire open world and RPG built on top of it as well. In a lot of ways, everything about the combat in Cyberpunk 2077, especially after the 2.0 update, is an absolute triumph. The fact that not just are there so many different playstyles for any kind of player, but that each has a lot of depth, and more importantly, is a lot of fun. In most other games, there's a way to play that's the most engaging, where certain other playstyles can feel lacking. But no matter what you do in Cyberpunk, you'll have a good time. And because of that, in terms of combat, the game is super replayable. replayable. It lives up to the RPG name and moniker. But where it doesn't quite hit the mark though is with choice and consequence, maybe the most important part of any role-playing game. You see, most RPGs like Fallout or Baldur's Gate have a ton of dialogue checks, countless moments where you have to make a decision about the fate of the people and the world around you, and oftentimes the consequences of these moments are well telegraphed and explained to the player. For example, in the first act of Baldur's Gate 3, your decisions to help or go against the Grove and who you choose to save or kill has direct and immediate narrative impacts on the start of Act 2. It makes it feel like all of your decisions you made earlier really matter. Cyberpunk as a game focuses a lot less on things like this though. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot more choice and consequence in Cyberpunk than most people give it credit for, but for the times it does give you choices, like in the All Foods, Militech, and Maelstrom quest in the beginning of the game, those choices don't actually change all that much in the world or story. You might save someone that shows up later in a side quest or help an NPC that has a special surprise for you if you do later on, but the game isn't built around tons of consequences in the world for your actions. Rather, it's about giving you a bunch of morally gray quest lines to just ponder over. There's one quest in the base game where you find a father and son who are selling brain dances of children being tortured and abused to sick individuals, and you can choose to shoot them on sight, to kill one and watch the other suffer, or let them go in peace after stealing the data you were hired to get. In other RPGs, your decision and the outcome would be the main crux of the quest. What you decided to do here would result in a change in the world or a new cutscene down the line that changes depending on what you decided to do with these twisted men. But in Cyberpunk, it's less about those outcomes and more about the journey, about making us think about things in our head and come to our own conclusions. There isn't any part in this quest that tells you to kill both or just one of the evil people to watch the other suffer, and there isn't a different ending depending on what you do. It simply is an encounter that you come across where your decisions in real time are meant to make you think, not to make you wonder how this will change the story, but wonder what you would do in the same situation. Another great example is a gig in the base game where a man asks you to follow his wife who he thinks is cheating, and when you find her in another man's room, you discover he's not an affair partner, but actually a ripper who has been changing her appearance for well over a decade since they first met, meaning the woman he married does not look like he thinks she does, and the reason his child does not look like he expected is because the woman he married is a lot uglier than he originally knew. But at the end of the quest, there is no big choice. Whether or not you choose to tell the husband doesn't matter. It won't have a huge effect on the game at all. Rather, the story is more focused on just giving you interesting situations like this to think about, rather than satisfying conclusions based on your choices. And that's why I've always defended the quests in Cyberpunk. Even though they don't have all the fun choices and consequences that are telegraphed well from some of my other favorite RPGs like Fallout New Vegas, Mass Effect, and Baldur's Gate 3, these quests always ended up making me think a lot more. If you ask me about some of my favorite side quests in games, most of them are from Cyberpunk. And the reason that is because those quests actually got me pondering about my real life, or feeling actually strong emotions for the situations I was put in. So while it was fun talking with my friends about how their outcomes for certain quests and other games played out, the best part was seeing those outcomes and hearing other people's stories, not even the quests themselves and the questions they posed. I will say though that one issue Cyberpunk really does struggle with is that while it's very replayable from a combat perspective, the lack of meaningful choice and telegraphed consequences means multiple playthroughs, especially through Act 1 of the game, become tiresome and drawn out when you know exactly what is going to happen and have to skip through all the dialogue and cutscenes that last many hours. They hit really hard the first time, better than any other game out there, but on subsequent playthroughs, becoming Johnny Silverhand, for example, the first time in a flashback becomes a roadblock to the open world rather than a super awesome reveal. However, in Phantom Liberty, a lot of the issues with consequence were finally resolved, and it also makes this section of the game a lot more replayable. Most of the gigs in the expansion have multiple different endings, massive choices you can make that will affect options later in the story. You might decide to help a bunch of citizens whose family members were killed by a cyber psycho, and if you do, when you come back days later, you'll see that they have banded together and formed a new tribe to get retribution after you have inspired them with your actions. If you end up saving a corrupt doctor who is taking body parts from alive patients to save others, all while making sure the gangs won't come back and mess with him, you can come back to his church later in the game and find a sprawling medical facility with tons of people and workers due to the fact that no one died. And it's things like this that elevate the Cyberpunk quest experience even more, because not only do these quests give you the insane scenarios and questions of the ones in the base game, but they do a better job of actually giving the player meaningful choices, ones that do in fact affect the world around them. And that's the story of Phantom Liberty in a nutshell. More of Cyberpunk, but better for the most part. The quests are more in depth with more interesting and better telegraphed decisions. The main characters keep you on edge the entire time with twist after twist, making it so there's no one you can trust. And most of all, the new zone Dogtown is just maybe the best in the entire game, with some of the most impressive environmental design and world building in the entire product. There are more NPCs with meaningful dialogue here, and there were so many times during the expansion I would just slowly walk around each part of this new zone and take in the sights, listening to people around me talk about what was going on in their lives and the world alike. Even more than the base game, Dogtown feels alive, and you can tell that CDPR really listened to the feedback from the community and made sure the final send-off for this game wouldn't disappoint. And not only that, but the main narrative of Phantom Liberty is just so enthralling. Putting a spy thriller into the Cyberpunk universe was the perfect fit, and as CD Projekt Red are known for, they crafted a narrative here that was filled with so many gray areas and hard decisions that I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. Having missions focused on infiltrating an enemy base and answering questions correctly to not get caught, or getting into an all-out brawl as the music intensity was turned up to 10 and a giant robotic machine chases you. There are set pieces and moments here in the expansion that put even the base game to shame, and in almost half the missions I felt like I was playing Tom Cruise in the next Mission Impossible movie in the best way possible. You can tell that an insane amount of love and care was put into every single detail in this zone as well. If you just take the time to walk around and look at every building and back alleyway, you'll discover so many little secrets, so much environmental storytelling, and once again, just like the base game, a place that feels real and lived in. Listening to Kurt Hansen on the intercom all over Dogtown be the fearless leader he's portrayed to be, and just taking in the atmosphere is the best part. But once again, even with all the great things that Dogtown and Phantom Liberty added to the game, even with all the amazing mission and quest design, it still doesn't surpass the thing that made Cyberpunk great in the first place. Because as much as I loved Solomon Reed and Songbird or Kurt Hansen as the villain, he's a hell of a lot better than Adam Smasher, that's for sure. It's those slower moments with Judy, Panam, and Johnny in the base game that are always what made it so special, and Phantom Liberty was never focused on that, and I don't think it needed to be. This expansion was about bringing back all of those people who said the game sucked after never even playing, or putting it down after giving it a shot. About showing people that beneath it all, Cyberpunk was always amazing, and that Phantom Liberty is just the chef's kiss on top of an already masterfully created ensemble. So for the future of this franchise, I hope that all the learnings from Phantom Liberty and the 2.0 update make their way into the product from day one. But I also can't stress enough that the core of even 2077 on release needs to be in the game too. The core of what makes art everlasting. Not cool set pieces and firefights, but the people and characters that pierce your very soul. So what do I want to see in the future of this series then? We already know that CDPR will be releasing a sequel to Cyberpunk codenamed Orion, and that it will be made on Unreal Engine 5 this time. And to be honest, it does have me a little worried. After 3 years of working on the Red Engine and updates, I can say for me at least, with full path tracing and DLSS 3.5, Cyberpunk 2077 is without a doubt the best looking game I've ever played. And as I said, it's the only game in my life where I've never fast traveled, and that's because the city and atmosphere on offer here is just so impressive and awe-inspiring. And the concern I have is that now moving over to a brand new engine, CDPR is taking a huge risk on this sequel. Yes, this means it'll be easier to acquire new talent and also hopefully less of a hassle dealing with an engine that gave them trouble before, but on the same token, I'm just a little apprehensive about Unreal Engine 5 being able to load such an impressive world so seamlessly with such great performance at the same time, even with technologies like Lumen and Nanite. And not only that, but CDPR in the last couple of years have changed a lot, and now instead of the entire studio focusing on one game at a time, there are multiple teams, with the Cyberpunk one opening a new office in Boston in the United States. And while this is awesome and hopefully means more games coming more quickly, it also means building up a brand new set of teams in a whole new location. If anyone can pull it off though, it's this team. And considering how good Phantom Liberty was, and just how passionate the leadership team for the Cyberpunk IP going into the future is now, I have a feeling it'll all turn out okay. In terms of what I actually want to see in the sequel itself though, first and foremost, I hope for more of the same. There's a reason Cyberpunk 2077 is my favorite game of all time, and it's because no other game really hits the high moments here quite like it. And more than anything else Cyberpunk Orion could do, it needs to remember what made Cyberpunk so great in the first place. A focus on characters and stories that make us cry, make us think, and give us moments that last in our hearts and souls forever. The sequel needs characters that can hit just as hard as the main cast in the original, and if anything, this will be the hardest part, because in many ways they did it so perfectly the first time around, and it's going to be hard to capture that same magic again without a lot of talent and work. Next up, quest and mission design along with environments should take a page out of Phantom Liberty's book. Focus on making each quest and side objective meaningful and in-depth with actually impactful decisions and choices that have us sitting in front of our computers wondering what to do for hours. One of the best parts of Phantom Liberty is how each gig sends you to a brand new location with so much verticality and history all its own in these crazy situations. It makes it exciting when you know no matter what you do, you're going to find a new place to explore and learn about this world. In terms of combat, just do more of the same. The focus on making you feel cool no matter what you do is everything Cyberpunk's about. And for the sequel, I think just adding even more options, more cyberware, and even tougher and smarter enemies that really test us would be the best solution. But what about the location? Where should Cyberpunk 2 take place? Well, in my opinion, I think Night City should be the main hub once again. There really just isn't any other location in fantasy out there quite like it. And I think if it was focused purely on next-gen systems only, it could provide the perfect breeding ground for an amazing world. Being able to come back to Night City, but this time with gangs with their own quest lines and more dynamic open world encounters would be a welcomed improvement to the city and would make it feel more alive. And it also would mean the team could reuse a lot of assets and locations and instead focus on making each of them feel more alive and in-depth with lots of quests at the quality level of Phantom Liberty. Having said that though, I would love to get to see some other locations in this universe too. One thing Cyberpunk lore does so well is it makes it feel like Night City isn't the only place out there. We constantly hear about things happening in Europe, Asia, Brazil, or how nukes fell in Dubai, and being able to visit some of these places even briefly would be amazing in the main story of the sequel. If I had to come up with what I think would be the perfect setup for the Cyberpunk sequel, here's what it would be. Playing as a new character some amount of years into the future, we get involved in a massive espionage mission for a big corporation, either Arasaka, Biotechnica, or Militech. And during this operation, we learn that another corpo war is about to break out, and even more concerning that many of the AIs behind the Black Wall are finally starting to find their way into the real world now that technological advancements have made their way far enough that these advanced AIs are able to break through. So suddenly, it sets the stage for a massive set of world-changing events where we'll have to choose sides between massive corporations and everyday people, as well as AIs that try to convince us whether or not they have humanity too. This would give us a chance to dive more into the lore of the Black Wall and the AIs to see how Mr. Blue Hands ties into it all, as well as learning more about each of the big corporations we missed out on in the original game. It's the perfect setup from not only a lore and world building point of view, but also simply from just an awesome story arc vantage point. On top of this, advancements in relic technology from Arasaka could mean that we're able to transfer our consciousness into husks in new locations instantly, rather than having to overwrite the minds of helpless individuals like before, meaning we could go in as an undercover agent or mercenary on missions in Japan, Switzerland, Brazil, or even in the space station at the Crystal Palace. So the crux of the game would take place in Night City just like before, meaning not many new assets would have to be created, and instead there would be a focus on just adding more and higher quality quests to keep the world feeling alive. But in the main and some side missions, we could use this technology to travel to smaller and more linear parts of other cities and locations, where we could get a glimpse of the cultures and histories around the world. And then, in the final mission of the game, we could use that same tech to travel to the Crystal Palace and finally get to see the zone that was likely originally planned as a DLC to Cyberpunk 2077. This would be the perfect setup for the sequel because not only is it ripe for so many awesome questions about what it means to be human or a computer, corporations versus the everyday man, along with the usual cyberpunk set dressing, but also it would allow us to explore even more of this amazing world that so many of us have come to love, with stakes even higher than the original that could lead to some of the truly most badass moments in the entire series. The possibilities with this setup are endless, and the team could really take it in any direction. So while I'm sure my exact guesses won't come true, I hope that the ideas for the sequel are at least somewhat along these lines, because I think it's the best way to make a new Cyberpunk worthy of its predecessor. Overall, it's crazy to see that after so many years of begging people to give this game a shot and screaming into the void about how good it really is, that people have finally come around. Cyberpunk 2077 is finally the game people always dreamed of, and the future for this series is brighter than ever with one of the best teams in the business at the helm. And it goes to show that when you make real art that has something to it, art that can move people, no matter how much hate or negativity there is, if you can fix the things that hold it back, one day it will shine. I was always told growing up that sometimes the good guy loses and the bad guy wins. That sometimes a product or piece of art, despite its greatness, is never fully appreciated. But the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that real art, real passion, and greatness has a funny way of always finding its way to the top. Sometimes it can take years, sometimes millennia, and sometimes the creators will never get to see that day. But when a product like Cyberpunk 2077 is made, one that beneath all the bugs and controversy was home to something so meaningful, the universe has an almost magical way of making sure people eventually find out. It's crazy to think that a game that I defended for so long is finally getting all the love it deserves. And in a weird way, this closes a chapter on the game that originally helped grow this channel right here. A game that I now consider my favorite of all time for so many reasons. And a game that reminded me why games as a medium are so special and how truly impactful they can be. So while it's a shame we won't be getting any more DLC for this version of Cyberpunk, we can only hope that the next one will have the same amount of love from day one. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. The support here means the world to me. And until next time.